very much indeed for that kind introduction. As has already been indicated, I'm going to be focusing on one of the various theories that I put forward, attentional control theory. Is this? Okay. Attentional control theory, and basically, let me just see. Where's the thing? It's disappeared behind there. Okay, yeah, thank you. Right, okay, so basically what I'm going to be focusing on is attentional control theory, and what it is designed to do is to address issues that are described here. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about trait anxiety. Trait anxiety is a personality dimension which refers to the extent to which people experience a lot of anxiety in their everyday lives. And so the question is, what are the effects of trait anxiety on cognitive processes and performance? I imagine the obvious answer to that question is that high anxiety has negative effects on performance, but I hope to persuade you this afternoon that reality is perhaps somewhat more complex than that. Okay. Right, I'm not going to deal with all of this. Okay, so what are the internal cognitive processes that are of most relevance to understanding the effects of anxiety on performance? And one of these is what's sometimes known as the inhibition function, which I'll say more about in a minute. This is concerned with attentional control in the sense of avoiding paying attention to things that are irrelevant to the current task that you're involved in. And secondly, there's the shifting function. We also need attentional control if we are performing a complex task and we need to switch our attention around amongst different aspects of that task. Then good attentional control is really important to perform the task effectively. Okay, and so more specifically within attentional control theory, it is assumed that anxiety impairs the inhibition function. In other words, it makes, if you are high in anxiety, you have poorer concentration, you are more easily distracted by task-irrelevant stimuli, and so on and so forth. Excuse me. And secondly, as we got down here, anxiety also impairs the efficiency of positive attentional control. In other words, attention is not shifted or not switched as efficiently and effectively within complex tasks when one is anxious. Okay, so that's the sort of the background to this. Now, in some ways, this slide is, in terms of the background, this is the single most important slide describing parts of the theory. I should perhaps say it is a complex theory, and I'm just focusing on a few key aspects of the theory in my talk here this afternoon. Okay, so we have the idea, if you're high anxious, that means you're going to have worse inhibitory control, your concentration, your attention is going to be distracted from what it should be, and you're going to find it hard to switch attention in the most efficient way. So the obvious prediction is, well, if those things are the case, then what we would expect to find, of course, is that high anxiety would impair performance. But have a look at the slide, because this is one of the most novel original features of this theory, is that it says that it is not just a question of that what also happens, oops, sorry, I need to go back, yeah. Whoops, back one more. But what happens is, let's keep this in simple terms. Supposing you're high anxious and you're performing a task and you want to do well, but you find that your attention is being distracted. What do? One thing you could do is just shrug your shoulders and say, well, so be it, I'm going to perform this task badly. Alternatively, you could say, I'm going to try to compensate for the problems I have with attentional control. I will use more cognitive resources, more processing resources to compensate for the adverse effects of the poor attentional control. Okay, so it's a two-stage process. First of all, you have impaired attentional control if you're high anxious, but then you often have compensatory strategies designed to prevent this impaired attentional control from making performance worse. So the key point is down the bottom there, that non-significant effects of high anxiety on performance do not mean that nothing has happened. Okay, so in the old days, you carried out an experiment. Let's compare high versus low anxious individuals on a task. You found no difference in performance, and so in disgust, you would just throw the data into the dustbin. Okay, but according to this theory, you could have a situation in which there is no effect of anxiety on performance, but there are some interesting things happening nevertheless. Okay, so as it says here, the non-significant effects do not mean that nothing has happened, and a simple way of describing this part of the theory is the notion that anxiety often has hidden costs. They're hidden in the sense that they are not obvious when you look at the performance of people who are high in anxiety. Okay, so that's enough in terms of the theoretical background. Most of the research has focused on poor negative attentional control, inability to keep focused on the task in hand. So I'll just quickly mention a couple of studies that show that sort of effect, and then afterwards, well, as it says in the title, I'll then move on. I'll try and keep it nice and simple. Aspects of cognitive neuroscience which have been applied to this particular theory. Okay, so here we have a fairly straightforward study. What happened here? So along the bottom here, this is increasing levels of trait anxiety, and this was a task in which it was visual search. People were looking for a specific visual target in a display, and either there were no salient distractors, or there were salient distractors, like an item in red when all the other items were in black. Okay, so the issue was, what are the effects of distraction? When you've got these vivid distractors, what effect does that have on the time taken to find the target? Okay, so what we find here, whoops, dear me, I need to go back in. Yeah, what we find is, I'm actually thinking it's quite a surprise. It's a friend of mine, Jason Moser, who did this study. What we find is the time taken to find a target when there's distraction, the effects of distraction were markedly greater for people who were high anxious than for people who were low anxious. And so we have a correlation there of plus 0.49, which is really quite impressive when you're comparing things that are completely different, like a personality measure and the effects of distraction in visual search. That is really, I think, a remarkably high figure. Okay, so this illustrates the point that people high in anxiety have poor attentional control, this negative attentional control ability to inhibit processing distractors. Okay, and then we come on to, this is a task in my laboratory. A few years ago we carried out lots of studies One of the things I like about this task, which I'm just about to describe, is that on the face of it, it seems an incredibly easy task. Okay, it's an incredibly easy task in a sense, but it involves successful inhibition. Okay, so the nature of the task, the anti-saccade task as it's called, is along the following lines. If I present a cue on that side, I want you to look that direction. If I present a cue here, I want you to look in that direction. That is all you have to do. You look in the opposite direction to the direction of the cue. Okay, now you would agree, you don't need to be very clever in order to understand what that task is. A very, very simple task, but you have to inhibit the natural tendency to look at a visual cue that is presented. Okay, so that's the task. Look away from the direction of the cue that is presented. Okay, what have we got? And then down the bottom here, we have an even simpler control condition. In this control condition, all you have to do is look in the direction of the cue. So you do what comes naturally. Cue appears here, you look there. Cue appears here, you look there. Okay, so what we're expecting to find is, even though the task is remarkably easy in many ways, we expect the high anxious individuals are going to find it harder to rapidly produce an eye movement away from the cue. Okay, so what did we find? Well, here we are on the left-hand side here. We have what happened in the pro-saccade task. So it's not a question that if you're high anxious you can't move your eyes rapidly. There's absolutely no effect there. On the right-hand side here we have the low anxious and the anti-saccade task. This is how long it took them to make an eye movement in the right direction. And here's the high anxious, how long it took them. And there's a nice, highly significant difference between the two. We actually carried out, there must be about 6 or 7 studies using this particular task, and we always found the same sort of pattern, so that's a robust effect. Okay, I can imagine what you're thinking, and that is that this clearly demonstrates that high anxious individuals have a problem with inhibitory attentional processes, but of course it doesn't directly address this issue about exactly what happens in other situations for which the theory is more closely designed. Okay, so we now move on to what are we going to do? We've got to find situations where there is no effect of anxiety on performance, and then see if there's anything interesting happening in spite of that. Okay, so we come to the question then, how are we going to assess what is happening in terms of the internal processes that are involved? Okay, so the theory is basically arguing that high anxious individuals, they're inefficient because they have poor attentional control, and then they have to put extra resources in order to prevent the poor attentional control from impairing performance. Okay, so the implication of that is that if we use the techniques of neuroscience, we might find something interesting happening inside the brain, even though anxiety is having no effect on performance. Okay, so we take a sort of an ideal situation, we find a task where there's no effect of anxiety on performance, and in crude terms, if high anxious individuals are inefficient and they're having to put extra resources in to try to cope with the task, then clearly at a very crude level, we would expect the high anxious individuals would have greater brain activity. That's a very crude prediction, would have more activation than the low anxious. But of course, as I indicate down the bottom here, there are lots of problems of interpretation here. Primarily, what on earth would this extra activation represent? What would it mean? So I think we can all agree what we need is a much more specific predictions. Instead of just saying, oh, somewhere in the brain is going to be more active if you're high anxious, we need to have more theoretically driven accounts of what we expect to see. Okay, so what should we do? Okay, so as I've just indicated, in general terms, what we need to do is make more specific predictions. Right, okay, so we need to, two approaches that we could take, and indeed both have been taken. One is we can predict which specific brain areas should show activation differences between people who are high and low anxious. And the second approach is to focus on the timing. At what point in time should the high anxious individuals show greater brain activity than the low anxious? So that's pointing us in the direction of making a bit more sense of what's going on. Excuse me. Okay, so where in the brain are the areas that are most associated with these inhibitory processes that high anxious individuals find difficult to make use of? Well, there are several areas, but the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is the area that is more associated with that type of inhibitory process than any other area. So a reasonable prediction then is, if you're higher, we take a task, there's no effects of anxiety on performance, but nevertheless, we might hope to find that high anxious individuals have more activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex because they're struggling to get proper attentional control when they're performing the task. Okay, and then the second question is, when do these inhibitory processes occur? Now, there are several versions of this task. It's known as the go, no-go paradigm, and I'll just give you one example so you can see the sort of thing. Okay, so one simple version of this task is you present a series of digits, and people have to respond and make a simple response after each digit is presented. Occasionally, unpredictably, say 10% of the time, the digit 3 is presented. When the digit 3 is presented, they must not respond. So that's the no-go trial. Okay, so you can see where we're going with this. So you need good inhibitory processes to stop yourself making the simple response on these occasional trials when a response is not required. Okay, so 90% of the trials are go trials, you just make a simple response. 10% triggered in some way or another, you are supposed to inhibit making a response. Okay, now research that had nothing to do with anxiety at all, but just there's been a lot of cognitive neuroscience research on this task, and what has been found is the crucial time at which you find a big difference between no-go and go trials is particularly at this thing here, around 300 milliseconds after the stimulus onset. It's known as N2, N for negative. Okay, so the details don't matter, but the point is that seems to be the time where inhibitory processes really kick in on no-go trials, is approximately 300 milliseconds after the stimulus has been presented. Okay, so here we have some much more realistic predictions. Instead of just saying somewhere in the brain is going to be more active if you're high anxious, we are specifying almost exactly what we expect to find. So firstly, I say we expect to find when inhibitory processes are required, we expect to find the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex will be more activated in high anxious individuals, and with the go-no-go paradigm, as I have indicated, we expect this N2 component at about 300 milliseconds should be more elevated because more effort is being required to inhibit the response. Okay, so there can be no complaints here. We have pretty specific sorts of predictions. And remember, in case I forget to keep mentioning it, the studies I'm about to talk about, in every case there was no effect of anxiety on performance. So historically people would have said, oh, I have found nothing. Okay, but we're going to be looking at what's happening inside the brain to see whether that tells a different story. Okay, well here just for those of you who don't know exactly where on earth the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is, there is a picture indicating exactly where it is. Okay. Right, so in this next slide, this is a study, this is using what those of you who study psychology will be familiar with, but I'll describe it anyway. It's known as the Stroop Task. Okay, so what you do is, for example, you present the word red, but it's printed in green. Okay, the word is red, but it's printed in green, and you ask people to say what the colour is. But of course, it's so automatic to read words that you see that you need inhibitory processes to stop saying red when you see the word red in front of you. Okay, so that's the difficult condition on the Stroop task. That's what's known here as the incongruent condition. So there's a lack of congruency between the word, which is one colour, and the colour itself, which is a different colour. Okay, and then you have simple trials, congruent trials. You could have the word red printed in red. Okay, so there's no inhibition required. Okay, so congruent trials, you don't need inhibition. Incongruent trials, you do need inhibition. And so according to the theory, we're predicting that high anxious individuals should have greater activation in this brain area on incongruent trials where you need inhibitory processes, but not on congruent trials. And happily enough, that is exactly what was found. So on congruent trials, there's very little evidence of activation in this area for either low anxious or high anxious. On incongruent trials, there we have some activation for the low trait anxious, but you can see it's substantially greater for those who are high trait anxious. So we have a pattern, but remember again, no effects of anxiety on performance on congruent or incongruent trials. Okay, and I'll just very briefly mention another study that's along very similar lines. Again, the people who did it are manipulating the extent to which attentional control is required. So without bothering about all the details of all this, we have maintenance trials. The MT trials don't require attentional control, negative attentional control, whereas the MP, the manipulation trials, do. And so we've got a very similar pattern here. There's, again, no effect of anxiety on performance. Here we've got exactly the same very small effect on this brain area when no attentional control is required. When attentional control is required, it's less impressive than in the previous study, but there is more activation in this brain area when attentional control is required for the high anxious than for the low anxious. Okay, so there are quite a few other studies that show a very similar sort of pattern of results. Okay, so that's studies focusing on where things might be happening. So remember, I mean, in some ways this is a striking finding. Behaviourally, there are no effects at all, but nevertheless, there is evidence that the high anxious are pedaling faster, they're putting more effort in, as reflected in greater activation in that area. Okay, so this is just really to act as a reminder. Okay, now there's a technique known, let's not bother about the details, there's a technique known as event-related potentials, which allows you to see the amount of brain activity almost millisecond by millisecond, so you can really see very detailed timing of exactly what is happening here. And so remember, the prediction is the crucial bit we need to look at is about 300 milliseconds N2, which should be greater in high anxious people if the theory is at least approximately correct. Okay, so what we have here, those unfamiliar with these things may find it a little bit puzzling. So, sorry, again, this is using the go, no-go paradigm. The crucial thing is what happens on no-go trials, and as you can see, where we first get a clear indication of a difference between high anxious, that's the dark colour, and low anxious, the lighter colour, is, if you look down there, it's just around the 300 millisecond mark. So again, fitting in with the theory, at the point in time where inhibitory processes are required, the high anxious are producing a greater effect. But interestingly, before the time at which inhibitory processes are used, there's no effect of anxiety at all. Okay. So we move on from that. Sorry, I mean these slides are taken out of the articles in which they appeared, so they're not as simple as perhaps would be ideal. What we've got here is what red stands for high anxious. Yeah, red stands for high anxious, and green stands for low anxious. Again, this time just to be clear, we're looking at the no-go trials again, and amazingly enough, so here's the high trait anxious, there's the low trait anxious, and again, amazingly enough, the largest difference between the two is exactly at the sort of point where it has been established that inhibitory processes are required. And Jeremy, sorry. Okay, and just checking the high. Oh yes, okay. What we also have on this slide is what happened on go trials. That can be discussed very quickly. Remember, on go trials, no inhibitory processes are required, and there were no effects of trait anxiety between the two groups. Okay, so for me, I mean, I'm obviously biased in this matter, but for me, I think this is really quite striking that we've got all kinds of data points all over the place. The theory says the biggest effects of trait anxiety should occur at around 300 milliseconds on no-go trials, and blow me down, I mean, that is exactly the pattern of results that we've got in that particular slide. Okay, so I'm going to leave this one out and this one out. Okay, now just very quickly, for reasons that are not altogether clear to me, there's been hugely less research on this notion that high anxious individuals are not as good, are not as efficient at moving their attention around between different aspects of a task. But I'm going to talk about a study that we carried out in my laboratory that did focus on this. Okay, so we have a nice simple task, so hopefully we will see what's involved in shifting. Okay, so the notion is that, again, in terms of the brain areas involved, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is also involved, even though it's a slightly different type of attentional control, and so is the premotor cortex. Okay, so we used a very simple task in which a digit appeared on the screen. If the digit appeared at the top of the screen, the participants had to decide whether the digit was odd or even. If the digit appeared in the middle of the screen, they had to decide whether it was lower or higher than 5. And if it appeared at the bottom of the screen, they had to decide whether the first letter of the digit lies between A and R or S and Z. Okay, so just to clarify that, So if the digit there is 7, then clearly it begins with S and lies between S and Z. Okay, so we have two conditions to focus on. One is which we have a series of trials where every time the digit appears in the same part of the screen. Okay, so you don't have to use any attentional control if you have a whole series of trials using exactly the same task. Where things get more interesting, where you need attentional control, is when it's completely unpredictable where the next digit is going to appear. So you can't predict whether it's going to be top, middle, or bottom. Okay, and so obviously this requires good attentional control to perform this task. Right, okay. In terms of performance, there was no effect of trait anxiety on performance. But when we had a look at what was happening within the brain, we discovered, happily enough, we discovered that under the conditions where this attentional control, this switching attentional control was required, we found that there was more activation within the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in high anxious individuals, and the same was true within parts of the motor cortex. But I think theoretically this finding is more important. Sadly, no one else seems to have done any research directly on this, but okay. Anyway, so just to sort of summarize a little bit, and I should perhaps emphasize, I'm only talking about, it was taking me sort of 40 minutes to talk about this slice of the theory, but just to summarize a bit on what I hope I have managed to demonstrate. Okay, so we have evidence that anxiety impairs the efficiency. People are not as good. They have to make more effort in order to cope with inhibition control and the shifting function. Anxiety often has no effects on performance, but nevertheless there is increased activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so therefore that's inefficiency and involves the use of compensatory strategies. We've seen that point is true for various inhibition tasks, and actually 4 there, I should say, point 2 is also true for the shifting function. So for both of these attentional control functions, we get this interesting difference between non-significant effects on performance, but quite strong effects on internal brain activation. Okay, and so we've seen that also, with respect to the event-related potentials, which I think is the most impressive evidence that's been accumulated exactly in the detailed time record of what's happening, where we predict to find an effect of anxiety, we find it. Okay, and then just in conclusion, the nature of science is its sort of a never-ending process of evolution and development. So clearly there are a number of things that remain really quite unclear. Okay, so one of the things that we really need is a more detailed account of the underlying brain mechanisms, and particularly a more detailed account of why are high anxious people, why are they inefficient in the first place. I'm sure an important part of that is because of their internal negative thoughts and worries and so on, which are using up some of their attentional capacity, but that remains not particularly thoroughly investigated. Okay, and then we have the issue, what is it that causes high anxious individuals? Why do they respond to having poor attentional control? Why do they, what causes them to respond by using compensatory mechanisms? And I won't again go into the details here, but there is, I can assure you, there is strong evidence that high anxious individuals, you get a bigger sort of brain reaction when an error is made than you do with low anxious. So it looks as if high anxious individuals are particularly sensitive to error. They seem to be better at detecting error, not necessarily at the conscious level, but in terms of brain activation, they show more brain activation when they have made an error. And so there's a certain logic there that if high anxious individuals are really good at detecting they've made an error, that detecting an error is likely to trigger efforts to try to reduce or eliminate errors in the future. Anyway, I think I have tested your patience long enough, so thank you very much for listening. Thank you.